After the election of Trump in 2016, a blog post by Deep Code went viral. In it, the author explained what had taken the vast majority of the media by surprise. It describes how the blue church, mainstream consensus reality as mediated by the liberal media, is being challenged by a new web-based insurgency, the Red Religion.
That entire document I wrote in a day. And it was actually, what ended up happening was I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who said, I don't understand what's going on. And as I was discussing with him what was going on, it dawned on me that the frameworks that I had been developing for a long time, that I, in some sense, tacitly assumed were just obvious, weren't obvious. And so I expected maybe 900 people might read this, and it might be helpful to 5 or 6, and that'd be cool. And obviously, it had more impact than that. It spread, well, pretty widely. And so as it turns out, it was of more value than I had anticipated.
Jordan Greenhall says the Channel 4 interview and the aftermath is another important moment in the collapse of the Blue Church narrative.
So during the interview, we see an example of a delusional framework that is what appears to be largely incapable of perceiving and reacting to reality in real time. But much more interesting is what happened afterwards, which was the sort of the self-healing and policing mechanism of the larger social consensus of how the Blue Church reactively goes about maintaining the integrity of its frame.
Do you mean when they try to characterize it as sort of abusive trolls and the alt-right hero and all of that?
Exactly. It's sort of a, to use a military language, it was a fallback position that was a reactive, almost instinctual, and not almost, in fact, precisely instinctual. It was a pure habit. And so what ended up happening was there was a break in the frame, there was a glitch in the matrix. The mechanisms of the Blue Church reacted to endeavor to control the frame and to convert it into a way of making sense of what occurred that still maintained the integrity of its frame. And that failed as well. And so the clash between what happened when the digital environment effectively completely controlled the frame, and the broadcast environment effectively tried and failed to do so, I think could be well characterized as running into the wall.
I was a journalist in the Channel 4 News newsroom for about 10 years.
That's fun.
And then working, making documentaries. And I guess I've still got a lot of those similar kind of connections and ways of thinking. And there seems to be, in the mainstream media, a sense that everything's going to go back to normal. Trump might get impeached or things. It still feels like an interregnum, and that reality will reassert itself in some way. Do you think that's naive?
Yes, I think that's naive. In fact, I would even say that it's delusional. That's my diagnosis of what's actually happening, is that people are moving further and further away from what thinking actually is, and more into merely running a script that is a legacy framework. It used to be thinking, but now it's just a framework for input-output responses to stimuli. And this, I think, is what we saw happen in the interview with Jordan Peterson on Channel 4 News that you called the glitch in the matrix.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's exactly that.
Could you explain what you think was going on there then?
Yeah, I think that if you imagine, I'm going to use some kind of more computational language, but if you imagine a very simple state machine that has predefined inputs and predefined outputs of how it responds to the world, effectively that's what the journalist was running. She was running a very simple state machine. It had no capacity to actually perceive reality directly, and so it could only select from a finite number of possible states of what was going on. And so this is why we ended up with this bizarre thing where Peterson would say X, and then she would summarize as, so you're saying something very much not X, but this is because she had like a list of possible things that could be said, full stop. Like it's just a finite list of possible things. And so if you weren't saying something that was in that list, all that she could do is select something from that list for which she had already a prefab set of possible responses. So it was a program in a very computational sense. And this is what happens when you begin to become delusional, when you begin to move away from a fluid intelligence that is in fact perceiving reality and responding to reality in a fundamentally creative way into a functional intelligence, which is selecting from a menu of prefab interpretive categories and executing on a program of prefab responses. And I should mention that this is not rare. This is actually commonplace. This is a natural, these are both natural states of the way that the human mind responds to reality. I mentioned that it's actually a fundamentally conservative principle, that sometimes it makes sense to have a fluid creative intelligence that is exploring reality. This is expensive. It's often makes errors, and it's not very effective at acting in the world. And this is called play or exploration. And sometimes it makes sense to just see something, identify it as being associated with things you know how to do well, habits, and then execute on those habits efficiently and then output. The problem is when you don't have the ability to switch out of a habit mode into a creative mode, and this is a particularly problematic situation when reality requires that you do that. You know, when you're driving your car and something anomalous happens, and instead of responding to the anomaly in reality, you just keep running scripts, you're going to actually run into a wall at full speed. Try as we might, our desire to interpret reality to mean what we want it to mean, at the end of the day, will always be checked against what reality actually is. It may be some time. You know, we're pretty good at making things up and pretending, but eventually, reality is reality. The culture war of the 20th century was a decisive success for blue and effectively a rout for red. So what we see first is that red was forced to move into a deeply exploratory phase. Second, that it did this in a context where, as it turns out, things were changing meaningfully, quite significantly. In fact, from my perspective, in a world historical level, the emergence of entirely new forms of communication, and therefore entirely new forms of sense-making and coherence. It's not necessarily the case that those two things would have overlapped, but they did. And so in a context of a blue church and blue faith hegemony, and I should mention, by the way, where particularly the blue faith increasingly was utilizing its coercive authority over most of the collective intelligence channels, media and education in particular, to establish its dominance at the level of values and to extinguish red values, put an enormous amount of selective pressure on the groups that were endeavoring to operate under red values. And of course, selective pressure either kills you or it makes you very clever. And so what ended up happening is you got a lot of exploration of different ways to survive and thrive under what were changing conditions. That's I think the thing to be really focusing on. If you're imagining, as I am, that we are witnessing a transition, we're witnessing a shift, which is largely characterized by, on the one hand, legacy, which has lots of power and inertia and energy behind it, and emergent, which has the advantages of being closer to a shift in reality. It's a ship that has a lot of inertia that is in the process of trying to turn. So the state is blue church, but the rate is red insurgency, or more specifically, the actual underlying shift between broadcast and digital. So one of the things that we're witnessing, or one of the things that we can use this event to make sense of, is saying, okay, where are we on that trajectory? What is the rate of change, and how are the relationships between the inertial power and coercive capacity of blue vis-a-vis the emergent capacity of red? You can almost like imagine two lines in a graph. Okay, where are we on that crossover? So what I would say is that this represents, we're getting closer and closer to the point of crossover. And that implies significant things across a number of different domains. And we can then use that to make predictions about what's likely to happen in the future under different circumstances. Say, for example, I apologize, any kind of event that emerges where there's a social need to make sense of what that event means for the purposes of then choosing how we're going to respond. We can now predict that the capacity of the blue church to control the frame and impose sense making on it is now below some threshold. And that the emergent capacity of this new phenomenon to be able to control the frame and make sense of it is now above some threshold. Openness is creative experimentation, the willingness to step away from habit and order and to take risks to see if any novelty happens to emerge. That's like a deep value, and it's the kind of value that is usually more common in the complex that shows up as blue. At a physiological level, which is why it's very sort of an interesting paradox that blue has in fact kind of got stuck in an ideology around openness rather than openness itself, which also is probably the pathway to how it actually finds its way out of it. Actually, that's actually quite important. If there's a way for the quote unquote children of blue, which is to say those beings, humans, who are able to fully connect with the underlying values in a way that is separate from and liberated from the constraints of both ideology and habit, and then embody those values in a fully authentic way, will discover that there is something about authentic thinking that is not the same thing as simulated openness. There's a distinction between an actual open mind and the simulacrum of open mind that is characteristic of the modern left. If you can grasp that and really embody that, you will be more fully in connection with your actual values. And by the way, also no longer delusional and therefore an actual exponent of what I'm calling the children of blue. Neither red nor blue as pure elements contain the ingredients necessary to actually be adaptive to reality. This is a disaster, in fact. It's a little bit like separating the hand and the eye. The eye can see, but if the eye takes itself as being the essence of virtue, it separates itself from the ability to do. And same thing with the hand. This is not a good thing. And this is what I was calling in terms of purple. There's hopefully what will end up happening is that the values that are currently being held back by the blue church will separate themselves, rediscover their actual values separated from their ideology, and then engage in an authentic exploration of these new modalities of collective intelligence, and begin the process of forming some new collective intelligence. In the process of doing that, they will also rediscover their ability to form extremely effective alliances with the value structures that are currently largely showing up in red. They're not mutually incompatible, far from it. And for most of human history, these groups have actually always commingled. They're necessary, that they actually relate to each other in a deeply healthy and direct fashion. Their separation into armed camps is extinctionary, actually. So then what will end up happening is that you'll see this, what I call a Cambrian explosion, because it will be extremely, if you take the values of openness as a pure aspect, they will explore quite openly, right? They'll explore vigorously and rather effectively.
What are the values of red that you think blue needs to integrate or to reintegrate?
Oh, that's actually pretty easy. Responsibility. I mean, we've actually even seen it. The ability to make a commitment and keep it, which by the way, ideologically shows up as either duty or loyalty, but those are both ideologies. The deeper sense is that ability. Responsibility, both at the individual and the group level, the ability to actually really make a personal sacrifice on the part of the group. That's actually a deeply red value. And I don't mean that, by the way, as politically ideological. Certainly there are people who are currently part of blue who feel that deeply. What I'm saying is that shows up much, much more intensely in red. And when you're feeling it in blue, you're actually feeling a red value, and that's good. Mixing them is crucial.
Because that's very Jordan Peterson-esque. How would you define Jordan Peterson, or do you think the issue is that he is not definable within one of those two camps?
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think that he grasps directly the fact that human beings can only actually make sense of the world by virtue of communication with other human beings. And this is all about the notion of admixture, that one must have a mixture of, well, I mean, he uses the mythopoetic to make sense. The order and chaos. The way, right? The Taoist way is the alchemical admixture of order and chaos. And that's it. Like, that's how you do it. And so if you bias towards orderliness, you find yourself in a rigid, non-adaptive, non-creative, non-exploratory framework, which will die because the world changes. If you bias towards chaos, you eat your young and evaporate, which also dies for obvious reasons. And the key is to actually enable these things to be in relationship with each other, in vital, healthy relationship with each other. And I think that's, in some sense, the essence of what he's focusing on, and is sort of the core of what he's actually about. Now, it seems to me that on the one hand, he connects more. Yeah, it does. It seems to me that he connects more closely with a lot of the values that would come out of red, out of orderliness, at a personal level. I certainly know that when I interact with his stuff, when I perceive his videos or I read his works, the aspect of me that has that in it seems to be the part that is called out and connected. Like, I can feel the aesthetic of, say, Sparta, which is very sort of red, as a metaphor, more so than Athens, but not radically so. And as a consequence, I think this is also one of the reasons why his audience has begun to self-select for individuals for whom that is a yearning and a calling. But that's not, and also I think because he's in an environment where he perceives the chaos aspect has run amok, and has locked out a lot of the orderliness stuff, he's also presenting an antidote. He's presenting a lot of more in the direction of orderliness and more in the direction of responsibility, because we're way off track on that front. To get us back onto the way, we're going to have to pick up a lot more of that to get us back in. But it's not just that. That's what is more needful now.
You said children of blue will form their own collective intelligences to fight back against this or to respond. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, in fact, this is a good opportunity maybe to double click on it. So the first thing is focusing on this fact that it is precisely because a set of values that were able to form an alliance and cohere in the latter part of the 20th century, and use the modalities of the 20th century media and collective intelligence landscape, broadcast, television broadcast in particular, to win, meaning that they were able to establish hegemony over the socio-political control structures. They have not yet been forced to adapt. Straightforward. You don't choose to adapt if you don't have to. And so, because they actually have high quality or reasonably effective ways of trying to make sense of the world, and in particular making choices and acting in the world, they are still operating under old frameworks and have not had to, and therefore have not endeavored to learn the new tools. Okay, so this is what I characterize as the blue church, and primarily the blue church problem. That is that the people, the human beings who have particular kinds of values that are not fully compatible with what's going on in red, and therefore have not chosen to simply shift their alliances and their energy and their attention into those domains, are constrained by the fact that their erstwhile allies, broadly speaking, are still largely stuck in the blue frameworks, both in terms of institutional structures and in terms of sense-making ideologies, et cetera, et cetera. And as I mentioned, these are increasingly delusional, which is problematic because when you're in delusion, you actually have a very hard time getting out of it.
And what advice would you give to people to navigate this new world?
Well, I've given advice already. I'd say that it keeps showing up as more or less the same thing. The first is free your mind. Be aware of the fact that the habits of the Blue Church and how it works don't work anymore. And so if it feels scary to step into a liminal space, recognize that that's okay. That's what you need to do. Step into a liminal space, recognize that your way of making sense in the world that used to work don't work, and you really, really need to set yourself free to begin learning anew. Child's mind, beginner's mind. Second, this by nature must in fact be exploratory. So swim. Do not make sense prematurely. In spite of the fact that the world feels dangerous, in spite of the fact that you may want to protect yourself in this dangerous world, doing so too quickly does not allow the natural exploratory approach to do what it needs to do. Really just listen and learn, go all the way back down to human base. Turn inward. Learn how fear shows up in you. Learn how not to allow fear to drive the choices that you make. Learn how to listen to the whole way that all of you perceives what's going on. Become more integrated with your own body. Go out into nature. Spend a lot of time not connected to the chaos that's going on, and a lot of time reconnecting yourself with your fundamental capacity to perceive reality in all the different modalities that human beings have the capacity to do. Then relearn how to use other human beings as allies in figuring out how to make sense of the world. I mean that really relearn. Like, we have been abused and constrained by institutional frameworks that remove us from our own native capabilities. So relearn that. Understand how to be a friend and an ally. How to have a conversation with somebody where you're really listening closely to get a sense of what their perspective brings to you. Where you're not obligated to agree with them. Where you're not obligated to move out of what you feel is right to form some new consensus reality, but where you're actually authentically recognizing that their perspective has some capacity to bring richness to your perspective. This, by the way, is almost exclusively possible in person. Now, what we're doing right now is an okay version of it, but we need to be very mindful of the fact that linear broadcast is bad, and even interactive bandwidth like this is not good enough. You know, you've got to learn from raw, physical. And get yourself into places where your consensus reality and your habits are willfully destroyed. Get into human-to-human conversations and get as far away from ideology as you can. Your job is not to know what the fuck is going on. Your job is to be absolutely certain that you have no idea what the fuck is going on, and learn how to feel from raw chaos, from raw uncertainty up. Then, and only then, are you finally able to begin the journey of beginning to form a collective intelligence in this new environment. That's my advice.
Great. Are you hopeful for the future?
I am, as it turns out, someone who seems to be relatively committed to endeavoring to do good things even under duress. So it seems that I am intrinsically hopeful for the future, even though at a rational analytic level, I would say that I would not put the odds in our favor.
Check the website for more great films, such as the first full-length documentary on Jordan Peterson, and for details of our upcoming events.